All right. So this is Look Mono Exploits, the Recon NG framework. So I want to welcome everybody to DerbyCon. If you're here to see fancy exploits and zero-day stuff, this is not the talk for you. I'm not saying it's a bad talk, but I'm not dropping any O-days, not doing any exploitation in this talk. Pure, unadulterated reconnaissance. All right. So who am I? My name's Tim Tomes, also known as Lanmaster53, begrudgingly. I'm a Christian father, husband, and veteran. And in that order, which is why I'm no longer serving, I always put family before. I'm a senior security consultant for Black Hills Information Security, ran by this guy right here, and all of these my beautiful teammates in here. Stand up. Wearing the green shirts, you can't miss them. Yes. They coordinated. I'm a SANS instructor. I teach web application penetration testing for the SANS Institute. I'm also a security blogger. I do most of my blogging on Lanmaster53.com. I also do some stuff over on paul.com for those of you familiar with paul.com and the Hack Naked crew. I also consider myself a coder, not a programmer. I can whip together some Python, but I'm definitely not a programmer, so please don't confuse me as such. Before I do anything else, before I get into this talk, I want to recognize some folks. Is anybody in here, is anybody on this slide in here today? If so, please stand up. Anyone that'll tell you, anyone that's managed a framework before will tell you that the framework is useless without modules. Unless you have somebody that's actually writing the modules to make that framework do stuff, the framework is useless. These are the folks right here that have actually built the majority of the modules that make Recon NG useful, so I want to recognize these folks first and foremost. Next, a quick disclaimer. Due to the dynamic nature of the demos that I'm going to do, I can't help the kind of stuff you're going to see. I mean, people use some crazy stuff as passwords. They use crazy stuff as usernames, and I just want to tell you straight up, I can't help that. It doesn't reflect my own personal feelings, but put on your big boy, big girl pants, and let's enjoy the show. All right, so I want to call this past year the year of reconnaissance. So about a year ago, in fact, it may have been a year ago to the day, it was last DerbyCon, I gave a talk on reconnaissance, the relevance of reconnaissance, and how it gets so pushed to the side in our current methodologies, right? And so I wanted to bring reconnaissance to the forefront. I wanted to bring it forward and say, hey, this is stuff that we need to be doing. We need to be paying attention to this because there's a lot of useful information here. So Black Hills Information Security and a bunch of other people that kind of took this on as well. We've been at the DerbyCon, HackerCon, ISSA conferences, SANS conferences, Black Hat, DEF CON, all over the place, talking about the importance of Recon. A whole bunch of tools have been released in the past year. Recon NG the script, which I released at DerbyCon last year. A tool called Pushpin. Threat Agent, Marcus Carey's online tool. Jigsaw RB is a script that uses Jigsaw to do some stuff. There's a bunch of tools. I'm sure there's many more than I put on here. But a lot of tools have been developed around reconnaissance. And also we've seen, if any of you that were at Black Hat and walked around and looked at some of the training that was going on, there was at least 2 or 3 dedicated open source intelligence gathering courses at Black Hat this year. And there were many, many, many more talking about the importance of Recon in the penetration testing methodology. Okay, and then based on that stuff, a whole bunch of new resources have been developed that we can actually leverage during the reconnaissance process. So Recon is relevant again. You know, this is awesome. Our efforts have actually made a difference. But to this point, we as an industry, we've really been focusing on traditional reconnaissance. So what do I mean by traditional reconnaissance? Well, first and foremost, the selection and verification of scope. So if you're doing a Black Hat penetration test, you got to be able to find your scope, find your target. We're going to use reconnaissance to do that. But more importantly, because most of us are doing gray box and white box penetration testing, verifying our scope, going out and making sure that the targets that we're giving to us are legitimate targets and that they're all inclusive, right? So I'll give you a quick story. There was a company, and I won't say that it was one maybe in the corner of the screen down here. We were doing a pen test, or they were doing a pen test, right? And customer gives us a scope, says, hey, here's our IP space, go attack it. So we start attacking it. We gain access to a network device of some sort via SSH with default credentials. Okay, and we're in, and we notice very quickly that the host name is something that's definitely not our client. So we go back to the client, we say, hey, client, this particular device does not appear to be yours. Can you validate this IP space for us? And they came back and told us that, no, that's not our box. That belongs to so-and-so. And we went back and said, well, hey, this is the IP space you gave us. And they say, well, our IPs are in that space, but they don't actually own that entire space, okay? So validating our scope is absolutely critical because a lot of times you're talking to some middleman that's not the network engineer. He's just relaying some numbers that were given to him. And if the engineer giving those numbers doesn't understand what he's asking for, then we've got an issue. So verifying your scope is very, very important. We're going to use traditional reconnaissance to gather information, right? We want to gather stuff for authentication testing. Say we got username harvesting flaws. We need lists so that we can validate usernames. Password resets. We want questions. We want to be able to answer questions that people, what's your favorite dog? What's your mother's middle name or something like that. So we want to gather information for authentication testing. We want to gather information for social engineering, contact information, information about relationships between people, right? And also the ability to gather information for developing storylines. So that's all very important. We want to learn about implemented technologies, okay? Looking at resumes, looking at requests for resumes to see what kind of skill sets are needed in a particular company, learning about the technologies that they've implemented. We want to be able to find some vulnerable code snippets using stuff like the GitHub dorks that Arsnake made so popular a few months back. We've got places, how many of you code? How many of you just throw code together? Now leave your hands up because you're going to answer the next question, yes, too. How many of you have copied code from a website somewhere and copied and pasted, right? People put code out there, right? And a lot of times developers for organizations, they put vulnerable code out there. And if you go and find that, you may find a live vulnerability that exists just by finding the code that they put somewhere because they need help putting something together, right? And then identify physical weaknesses in security. This is kind of reconnaissance from say, a defense perspective, right? Long-range reconnaissance, taking pictures, looking at the facility, trying to find weaknesses in physical security. But as I said 2 slides ago, because of the emphasis that's been put on recon over the past year, we've seen a lot of new resources come about. And these resources are really, I think, have created a new advanced style of recon that we're going to talk about today. Things that are included there is the ability to efficiently develop storylines. So instead of tracking people down manually using a search engine, we've got resources that will tell us where particular users exist on the internet. We just go to those places to get that information. Enumerate server-side technologies. There are services that are already fingerprinting the web-facing services for us, telling us what servers are running, what technologies are running on the back end. We can query those. Discover live vulnerabilities. There are companies now that are scanning the entire internet for stuff like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, blind SQL injection, XPath injection. We can just go to those websites and ask them, hey, have you seen any vulnerabilities on these websites? Discovering vulnerabilities. And we can harvest full credentials, right? We've all heard about network breaches where people's passwords and usernames, hell, many of you may have been involved in some of those network breaches. Well, there are companies out there whose entire business plan is to take that information, harvest it, and then turn around and sell it or make it available. Well, we can leverage that information in order to get clear text credentials to target websites, VPNs, things of that sort, without ever sending a packet to the network. And then we can conduct that remote physical security analysis from the comfort of our own home. Right? We can use something like Pushpin and social media that's geotagged to find pictures and videos of local places on the planet without ever actually being there. So what's our biggest restriction to penetration testing? It's something I harped on a bunch last year. Biggest restriction. Time, right? We don't have the time to actually accurately replicate what the true enemy would do. So if we don't have the time to do traditional reconnaissance, how on earth are we going to have time to do advanced reconnaissance, right? Who has the time? Well, the truth is, you do. Everybody has the time, using the Recon NG framework. Using the framework, we can do reconnaissance in about an hour, right? I'm going to do some here. We'll take about 30 minutes, hopefully, of demos to get it done. But if you're actually going to put a little bit of time in analysis, it takes about an hour to do a full recon. I think we've all got an hour we can spend to do this. There are some caveats to doing reconnaissance on open sources. The first one is you could possibly violate non-disclosure agreements or contracts. All right, something you definitely want to keep in mind. There's a couple of ways that you can get around this or comply with this. You can use anonymizing proxies to try to prevent the attribution of you to the information you're going after, or you can just get authorization. So at Black Hills Information Security, we make sure our clients know that we're going to be gathering this type of information from open sources, and we have them agree to it. If they don't want us to do that, then we don't do it, right? Authorization trumps all. So get it authorized, and then you can use these types of techniques. Active recon versus passive recon. I call it recon versus discovery, right? But a lot of folks say that, hey, if I'm sending packets to the target network, it's active reconnaissance. If I'm doing it on open sources, it's passive reconnaissance. We want to focus on passive reconnaissance. The other thing is not all data is free. I use a lot of APIs throughout this, throughout the framework. Some of the APIs cost you nothing to get the keys. Others cost you about 60 grand a year at their lowest tier of access. Okay, so the information is not always free, and it varies in this level of value. It's up to you to make a decision which way, whether or not you actually want to pay for it. Okay? So what is the Recon NG framework? First of all, it's an interactive framework. It's not a menu-driven UI. Okay, so it's very, very much like Metasploit in the sense that you can interact with it using multiple different commands rather than just walk through a menu. All right, it's got the look and feel of the Metasploit framework. So I did this for a couple of reasons. Number one, I wanted no learning curve. I wanted people to be able to pick up the Recon NG framework, and if you've played with Metasploit, you could just use it. It just works. All the same commands work. It looks the same. It feels the same. People have given me grief about that, but I actually think it's a good move. I think it helps the industry and the users. It's modular, much like Metasploit, right? So everything's done within the framework through modules, and we'll talk about a bunch of those. It's data-driven, so everything is stored in a back-end database, and every module does one of two things. It either puts information in the database, or it takes information out of the database and manipulates it, okay? So everything's data-driven. It's scriptable using resource scripts. For those of you that use set and Metasploit and W3AF, you're very familiar with what resource scripts are, but I've also built in Recon CLI, which I released in Black Hat. Haven't heard much about it from the community, but it's one of my favorite things. It actually allows you to take all the functionality within the framework and run it straight from the command line, so you can bash script it and things of that sort. Very, very scriptable. It's heavily documented on the wiki, so if you tweet me and you say, hey, how do you do this? I'm just going to tell you to RTFM, because there's a whole bunch of stuff on the wiki. I put a bunch of time into actually getting that stuff on there, so walking through how to get API keys, things like that. Heavily documented on the wiki. It's developer friendly because I have all the documentation on how to develop on the wiki. It's written in Python. Native Python, no third-party modules, all right? Which is, I think, how many of you hate installing third-party modules to use a piece of software, all right? Only like 10 people? Come on. Really? All right. I don't like installing third-party modules. In fact, that's like the bane of my contributors' existence, is they give me some awesome module that uses 3 different third parties, and I'm like, figure out how to do it in native Python. And then sometimes they get it back to me, sometimes they don't. But maybe one day I'll stop being so stubborn. You can get it at www.recon-ng.com. Okay, another important fact. I did not write a Recon NG framework to overlap with any of the other frameworks. It doesn't replace your set, Metasploit, Burp, or W3AF. It falls in line with them. Specifically designed that way, right? I saw a gap in reconnaissance. I wanted to fill it, and the Recon NG framework does that. So some quick UI highlights I want to run you through. Some of the 2 biggest things I get when we start talking about Recon NG is A, how the heck do I use it? Right? And I'm not going to tell you how to use it, but I'm going to show you some cool features. And then B, how does it fit into your reconnaissance methodology? And that's kind of where I want to focus. All right? So UI highlights very, very quickly. When you get into the framework, you see the nice little banner here, and you don't type 64 to access the Recon NG modules. Okay? Remember, this is not a menu-driven UI. Okay? So when you see this, what's the first thing you're supposed to type? Help. There we go. And you got all the commands that are in there, okay? And it's interactive help, so you can say, well, I want help on what info does, right? And it'll tell you what info does, right? Or not IFO, but info. All right, so you've got some help there. It's interactive. Command completion everywhere. So if the framework can anticipate something that you're going to type, it'll command complete it for you. So show, and you can see that here. And hit tab, and it'll show you everything that's there. So it's tab completion everywhere. Say that again? Oh, that sucks. Control L? Ooh, I like that. All right, I'll do that from now on. Thank you. So smart loading. And this is something I would really like to see in Metasploit at some point in time if there's any developers in here. When you go to load a module, if you can just type in any string, and if that string is unique to any particular module in the framework, it loads that module. Otherwise, it tells you, hey, there's multiple modules. Which one do you want? So if I load isPwn, then it loads the isPwn module. But obviously if I just load pwned, it gave me a bunch of different ones. So that's kind of a nice feature, thanks to this man right here, Ethan Robish. Module switching, you can now load modules from within modules, which I didn't have before. You kept on having to go back and forward, and a lot of people voiced that was a real pain in the neck. Direct data access at any point in time, you can query the database straight from the command line, which is nice. And it works in workspaces. So here, if you show workspaces, you can see that we're running in the default workspace. We are going to set the workspace to FBI because that sounds like a fun target. All right, so there we go. So it works in workspaces. Every workspace has its own database. Every workspace has its own settings, so that your settings save over from one to the other. You can keep your clients or your targets separate. All right, and it's got a lot of verbosity and debugging settings. So if you're going to send me a bug report, turn debugging on, run the module, show me how it breaks, send it to me in email. All right, so that's a quick UI overview. Don't want to do too much there because we're really interested in functionality. So how does it fit into how does it actually fit into my methodology? Well, I start with host harvesting, I move into context harvesting, then I go looking for credentials, then I do physical security stuff, and then I move on with the second phase of the methodology. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to follow here. First thing I want to talk about is host harvesting. What are the reasons we do? What are the things that we do here? Some of it's traditional, some of it advanced. Well, we're doing scope selection validation, server-side enumeration, and even in some cases port scanning. I'll explain that when we get there, and vulnerability discovery. So there's a lot of different ways we can do scope selection or verification. We can use Whois, that's kind of the standard go-to. AdSense and Google Analytics lookups. So how many of you use AdSense or Google Analytics at all in your web development? A couple of you? Well, what I like to do is go to my target websites and see if they're using it, and if so, do a reverse lookup on those Analytics and AdSense IDs and find out what other hosts are being developed by that particular person, because that may be a direction, that may be an identifier that that host belongs to, it should be in scope, right? And you can do that at whois.com. We can use the search engine site directive. For those that aren't familiar with the site directive, you can narrow down all of your searches to a particular domain using the site directive. You can also remove domains using the site directive. So if you do site:sans.org, you see a bunch of responses there for www.sans.org and isc.sans.org. You can then use the minus sign to say minus site www.sans.org, minus site isc.sans.org, and it'll show you all the ones that aren't those. You keep doing that, eventually you have a Google version of a zone file transfer of sans.org. So that's a neat technique that we use. Use the Shodan hostname operator, which is really, really nice. Those that are familiar with Shodan will show us all the hosts that Shodan knows about with that particular domain. We can try to brute force DNS using something like Fierce or Carlos Perez's DNS Recon. We can use IP neighbors to actually then say, hey, well, I have this IP address. What other websites are virtually hosted on that same IP? And get those hosts back. And we can use geolocation as well. So let's demonstrate some of this capability. First thing I want to look at is Bing domain. That's using Bing uses the domain modifier like Google uses the site modifier. So let's load that, show our options. Actually, let's go back here and let's show options, because we want to set some global options for the actual demo. Let's set the company to Federal Bureau of Investigation. Anybody here in the FBI? You're not going to tell me, are you? No, I didn't figure. All right. Set domain FBI.gov. That might have some interesting responses in it. All right, so we go here, we show options. It's already pre-filled out for us. We run it. It's going to go out and it's going to use that domain modifier to just pull a whole bunch of hosts from Bing for FBI.gov. And it's going to pull a lot of it. Now, this sleeping to avoid lockout, what is that? It sleeps randomly somewhere between 7 and 15 seconds in order to prevent lockout from Bing. Does the same thing for Google. How many of you have been blocked by Google before? Because they thought you were a bot? Yeah. I bet your coworkers loved it, didn't they? Especially when you're on a natted network, right? Well, let's go ahead and just kill this because you see where this is going, right? Okay, so let's load the Netcraft module, and let's use Netcraft to do this as well. We'll see that the options, as long as we set them globally, they're pre-filled within the module. So set your global options, it'll save you time. It found a couple of additional modules for us. I mean, a couple of additional hosts. Shodan is down today for maintenance for those of you that were tracking Twitter, so I can't use the I can't show you the Shodan hostname module at the time. But now I've got here, we can show dashboard here. I've got 75 hosts in the database that belong to FBI.gov. I can do show host and show those to you. You see them all in there. We've got a lot of data that we want to try to collect on these hosts. IP address, regions, country, geolocation information. So let's go ahead and start filling that stuff out. The first thing I want to do is resolve all of these host names to IP addresses. And I'm going to use the Google name server to do so. And we see that we now got IPs in here for those that actually resolve to something. Now that I have IP addresses, I can do some of those reverse IP lookups, right? So let's use Bing IP to do that. What we have, let me say something. All right, so showing the options here. Some of these have a search string, so you want to make sure, if you do a reverse lookup on IPs for like a politician or something, you're going to find porn sites and all kinds of crazy stuff that are co-located with politicians' websites. So here we give you set this domain here and it makes sure it filters all those and only adds to the database the ones that make sense. So that's what we're doing here. It's actually pulling all the IPs from the database, doing reverse lookups, and only storing the ones that are at FBI.gov. So let's run it, and it's going to find a whole bunch of stuff. Looks like it found 68 total hosts, but all of them are duplicates, so no new ones found there. That's okay. So let's go ahead and fill out the database by geolocating our targets. IPInfo-DB is an API that allows us to do this. It's going to go through and geolocate this stuff, and if we go to show host now, you can see that we've got a full recon of hosts for FBI.gov, right? So we do this relatively quick, 5-10 minutes, we've got all of this data to work with. Okay, so let's move on to this next phase. Once we have hosts, we just did some traditional reconnaissance. Now we want to take it to the next level. We want to start digging deeper into the methodology. Let's start with server-side enumeration. A bunch of different things we can do here. We can start looking at response headers for server headers and cookie names and things of that sort to try to determine what server-side technologies are being used. We can analyze error responses for purposely generated errors. We can use a browser, and we can use tools like, sure, go ahead. Yes. Yes, it can. Yep. He said, what if the host record response with multiple IPs doesn't handle that? It does. It creates additional records in the host table for that. Absolutely. Right. So server-side enumeration, we can use our interception proxies to analyze a lot of that data so that we can try to figure out what's happening here. We can use Nmap and Zmap to do port scanning on the remote network using the operating system enumeration and service enumeration to try to figure out what's going on. But all this is going to require some sort of direct contact, right? We said we're doing passive reconnaissance here. We don't want to make direct contact. We don't want to send any packets to the target network. So we use things like these resources here, built with whatweb.net in the 2012 Internet Census. Who here is familiar with the 2012 Internet Census? Anybody? So basically what a guy did is he used default credentials on embedded appliances to essentially turn them into a large botnet and scan the entire Internet in 2012. Turned around, made that data available to anyone. What I've been using it for is if I run into a network that's got anti-port scanning countermeasures in place, I just use the 2012 Internet Census, and I usually have about a 90% accuracy on open ports on the target. That is awesome, right? That is a great capability, and it's something that's built in the Recon NG framework. Builtwith.com is essentially a place that is going out there and enumerating client and server-side technologies for web applications, and you can go to builtwith.com and just ask them, hey, what is this site using? It'll tell you ASP.NET, it's got Microsoft SQL on the back end, or something like that. So very useful information. And then we take that information in a lot of cases and we say, okay, I know that it's using this particular operating system, this is a particular version, are there any vulnerabilities in that? So we use the internet, we go out to CVE details, place like that, we do a little bit of research, and we try to do some discovery on that, okay? However, we're not doing any validation here. We're not sending any packets to the target network. Got to remember that. But we could do it manually or use something like the following items here. asafeweb.com, XSS, or PunkSpider. Who here is familiar with PunkSpider? All right. PunkSpider was released at ShmooCon of this year. Basically, it's a group of guys at Hyperion that have developed a web scanner that's scanning the entire internet for cross-site scripting, blind SQL injection, and SQL injection vulnerabilities. And the data is available for free. You can go to the website and type in a domain, and it will tell you whether it found any vulnerabilities on a site on that particular domain. Pretty handy information. Once again, vulnerability discovery without ever sending a packet to the network. So let's see how some of these look. Is anybody keeping time by any chance? Or am I supposed to be doing that myself? So FBI.com built what's going to go out, and it's going to say, hey, for FBI.gov, these are all the technologies I've seen. Pretty handy information. We go through here, do some manual analysis. We can figure out a lot about that website. So let's load PunkSpider. Here we have target, FBI.gov is our target. We run it here. And good for FBI, they don't have any vulnerabilities. But what does it look like when they do have vulnerabilities? Well, let's set the string to roadbike.de. Don't ask me how I know this. And we run it, and we see that there's a vulnerability there, or 5 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. If we want details on that, we can set vulns to true. Yep. We can set vulns to true, run it again, and it will actually give you proof of concept URLs for all of the injections on that particular target. All right? So, pretty nice stuff. Hey. That clap is for the Hyperion guys. They're the ones actually collecting this data. We're just leveraging it, right? So pretty cool stuff. So I guess there is your 0 day that you were looking for. Anybody looking for exploits? Here it is right here. So PunkSpider provides that kind of capability to us, which is nice. And now let's load that census module. This is going to kill me. So basically what this does by default nature is it takes all the IP addresses from the host table and it does a port scan on them. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And it comes back and says, hey, do you have 80 and 443 open on each of these IPs? Basically what that means is all of our host names have resolved to those 2 IP addresses. So those are the only unique ones from the database. All right, so now we've got port scan data on it as well. At this point in time, we've done a pretty good job of collecting information on our target hosts, have we not? All right, we've got a lot of data to work with, and we've not even sent a packet to the network yet. So at this point in time, I move on with my methodology into gathering contacts. All right, I want to get into contact harvesting at this point. I want to gather some information on them. I want to do some data manipulation on that information that I gather, and then I want to start developing storylines for social engineering if it's within scope. So who here is familiar with LinkedIn? Everybody should raise their hand. All right, gotcha. You don't even need to raise your hand for that one. Social engineering means social networking for professionals, right? That's why we like LinkedIn.com, because people rarely lie about their name and use handles and stuff on LinkedIn. They use legitimate information. So that's where we want to go to harvest information about targets. Right? It's accurate and precise. Jigsaw got real famous this year after we blew it wide open at DerbyCon last year. Right? Jigsaw, cloud-based CRM, owned by Salesforce. They bought them out in 2010 for about $150 million, if that doesn't tell you the value of the information they're holding, right? So very, very neat, very, very large database of contacts. Now, initially, you have to go, it's intended for salespeople to go purchase an account and then access full contact information for individuals. Phone numbers, email addresses, physical addresses, first name, last name, job title. But they make available for free on their website first names, last names, and job titles. All right? Does that sound like the information that we would need as penetration testers? Yeah, because we can take that information and we can turn it into email addresses, and then by knowing their job title, we can begin to spearfish the targets that we want to go after. Okay? Now, originally, there's a module built into Recon NG which scrapes Jigsaw for this information. I will tell you that it's a cat and mouse game. They constantly change things and put countermeasures in place and then not violate the terms of service by breaking that, right? I wouldn't recommend doing that. By the API. So we actually use the API at Black Hills Information Security. It's not rate limited. It's super fast. Costs about $250 a year, which is a drop in the bucket for most penetration testers. As an added benefit, you get about 350 full contact queries, which means that you can then go and access full contact information, phone numbers, things like that, for other social engineering type attacks. So Jigsaw is a great resource. And then also we have PGP key servers. That's a great place to go find email addresses for people that belong to your target company. Because who uses PGP keys? People that want to secure information, right? Which means they probably got something we want. So by looking at PGP key servers, we find some really interesting people to go after. All right, so let's demo some of this. I remember this time. Control L. So let's load Jigsaw. Applause, please. You can see we've got a bunch of stuff there. Let's load search contacts. Show options here. We already filled out for us, and go. Now it comes back and says, hey, which one do you want? Because we got a couple of hits for Federal Bureau of Investigation. We obviously want this one. It's got 1,031 contacts. We just hit enter because that's the default. And here we go. Very nice, right? Very nice. Keep on going. That's with the API. The web one will do that as well. It just takes a lot longer. All right. So here if we go and we show our contacts now, we got a whole bunch of data in there. All right, but we're missing some stuff. I'm not even going to get in there. The columns here. So we're missing email addresses. We're missing. Actually, I think that's the only thing we're missing is email address. So we're harvesting contacts here. I would show you the LinkedIn module, but I think actually, let's try something. Load LinkedIn. Yes, it uses the LinkedIn API, and that's kind of something I wanted to tell you real quick about that. I got to go back in my FBI workspace. All right, so load LinkedIn. It uses the API, which means that it's restricted to your contact pool, right? So you want to grow your connections. You want to grow your connections to as large as they possibly can, pay for that third level connection, and then you'll have pretty much everybody on LinkedIn. But you go and you run this, and it goes, and here I pulled back 7 new contacts based on my relationships through LinkedIn. So it's kind of nice. Doesn't provide nearly the coverage that Jigsaw does, but you can get some pretty good results out of this if you pay for that 3rd level. This is only using a 2nd level, right? So if you paid for the 3rd level connection, which we do at BHIS, you can get a lot more connections there. All right, so we've got a bunch of information about individuals at this point. We want to expand this, right? We've got first name, last names, job titles, and where they're at in the country, but we need email addresses. We want usernames, right? We're doing social engineering, username harvesting, credential guessing here. So we've got to build that contact. Well, how are we going to do that? First, we've got to get the email domain. We can do that a couple different ways. We can use MX record lookups to find the email domain. I mean, we probably already know what it is based on the hostname reconnaissance that we've done. We can use whois contacts to see if maybe their whois contact is an internal person. We can try to get their naming convention from there, or their domain. Right? The next thing we want is the naming convention, right? Is it first name dot last name? Is it first initial last name? That's a critical piece of information when we're building these email addresses. We can use websites. We can use whois contacts. Things like the PGP key search server, right? They may have, if we see valid email addresses there, we may know what the naming convention looks like. We could use Baidu. So search engines don't let you search for the @ character anymore. Baidu still does. Baidu is kind of the Chinese Google, right? In fact, I got to show you this because I ran into it the other day. I did one for FBI.gov and found this. Now, let me tell you about this little thing right here. This Don Smith at FBI.gov is one of two things. He's a criminal with serious problems, or he's the worst undercover agent ever. All right? The worst. But Baidu found this, so it's kind of neat. It's another resource you can go and find that information. You can just use trial and error, right? You can just try to guess it, send some phishing attacks, and see if it lands, right? If you get errors back from the mail server, then you know they're not legit. And then finally, we can use the Jigsaw API. We can use one of those 350 full requests that we have to actually request a full email address. And how do we create an email? We take our information, we mangle it with the domain, and we create email addresses. So let's actually do that. All right, so let's go over here. Let's load yes, I know. Load whois POCs. Show the options here, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, run it, and we're going to get a whole bunch of stuff from whois. All right, show contacts here. Actually, let's go back and look. Oh. You know what? Let's not do that. Let's go ahead and just run it again. It'll be faster. All right, so you can see we get a bunch of stuff here. My first name dot last name at FBI.gov, John.memo at ic.fbi.gov. Sort of looks here like it's first name dot last name, right? All right. So we can kind of begin to guess how this email thing's going to fold out or going to unfold. Let's try one more module though, just to validate that. Let's load the PGP search one. You don't need to see this. Just take my word for it. Make sure we got our options set. We run it, and we find a bunch of interesting stuff right here, right? Pretty cool. This looks like just first name, last name with no dot, right? Got some interesting stuff in here. People really enjoy giving the FBI a hard time. You should see the NSAs. Hey, run this against. There's some good stuff in there. But in any case, we'll go with first name dot last name, right? Just because it makes sense based on some of the data that we've seen. So we load a module called Mangle, and I'm not hitting Control-L. All right. Here we go. Load a module named Mangle, and this one's kind of neat. So you see we can set a pattern here, and this pattern is you have 4 different options: FI, FN, LI, and LN for first initial, first name, last name. You set a pattern, you apply it to all the information in the database, and it dynamically creates email addresses. So let's just run this. And there we go. We've got our 1,000 and something email addresses. Okay. So at this point in time, we've done a pretty good job of harvesting hosts, and we've done a pretty damn good job of harvesting contacts as well, all within about, what, 20, 30 minutes it's been? Okay. The last thing I do once I have my contacts is I want to start creating storylines, or I at least want to know where I can go to get information to start storylines. So I use a little module called NameCheck, and rather than go back to the slide and jump back into the demo, we'll just go right into it. So let's load NameCheck. And NameCheck is a website, basically, that what they do is they allow you to go check and see if your if the username you want to have on a website is already taken. All right? Now, how great is that for us? We can just say, hey, where's this username at? And it tells us all these different places, so we can go right there and harvest information about our particular target. All right, so here we just show options. We have to set a username, and let's use Mubix. Anybody here know Mubix? He's all over the place, isn't he? Is Rob in the room? No? All right, well, we're going to use him anyway. So let's set username. Yes, most of it is free. We haven't got to the expensive stuff yet. Name check, and you can see here it just starts going through and it starts finding out where the username MOVEit exists on particular resources. And there's like 180 something different resources that it will go through. All right. This will take a long time to run. We're going to build threading into this eventually. We just haven't done so yet. But this is gives us a really good head start of where we can go looking for information about our particular target. Okay, so let me go ahead and kill this, and we'll move on. That's back to the name check stuff. The last thing I do, once I've harvested hosts and I've harvested contacts, I want to try to find credentials. Okay? So the credential thing is fun or interesting. We talked about how some companies have made it their entire business out of harvesting these dumps, right? Well, we've got a couple of companies that do that. Should I change my password.com is one, and then owned list is the other. Should I change my password.com does not store credentials, whether hashed or clear text. Owned list does. Okay, owned list stores that information and makes it available to us via their API, but it is very expensive. Quick note on that: if this owned list stuff interests you and you want to get in contact with them and you'd like pen testing firm prices, get a hold of me directly. Bring me your card, your contact information. I can put you in touch with some folks over there. Otherwise, if you go straight to them, it's ridiculous expensive. I'm talking their lowest tier is 60 grand a year. All right, so it's not cheap. All right. But once we've gone to own list and we've said, hey, here's a domain, give us all the credentials you know about it, we run into a problem. And that problem is that some people are just doing things right and they're hashing their passwords or credentials on the server side. Well, we can use hash database lookups on the internet to try to reverse some of those hashes and get the clear text from them. And that's what I do next. So let's jump into that demo. So the first thing I got here is I want to scope the domain to find out if there's any available creds there first. Before I go doing a bunch of work, I've got a let me do Control L here. I've got a module called isOwned. Right. And what it allows you to do is ask the API, does the FBI.gov domain have any credentials associated with it in your database? And in this case, there's 179 sets of credentials. And you can look at the last one seen was August 19th. Right? About a month ago, or a little over a month ago. Chances are some of those credentials may still be active, may still be useful for accessing VPNs or the web application. Because normally they reset passwords, every 30, 60 days, 90 days, something like that. Right? So we're interested in this information. I know right off the bat whether or not I actually want to go after it. Now I've already harvested a bunch of usernames for FBI.gov. So the first thing I'm going to do is load a module called web owned list. And what this one does, I'll just go ahead and have it running while I'm talking to you about it. What this one does is it goes and it uses the owned list website front end to scrape for each particular user. Right? So this is not using the API, and this is absolutely free. And as you can see, when it gets a hit, it tells you when it's seen it and how many times it's seen that particular username. This could take a very long time to go through the 1,200 users that we've harvested. So we're not going to do that, and we're just going to say, hey, I want all the creds for FBI.gov, all 179 that I know owned list has. So what I do is I load the domain creds module. Show the options here, real simple. Run it. And the first thing it does is say, hey, this is going to decrement your quota by 10,000 queries. This request on the $60,000 price mark is about $600 for those of you that pay full price for this thing. It's an expensive request. Is the data worth it? That's up for you to decide. However, to me it is, especially right now. And so we go here, we say yes, and it dumps out a whole boatload of creds to the database, right? So let's go here. So now there's a creds table in the database, and if we go to show creds, you'll see that we've got some hash, some passwords, swordfish, right? Wow, it's a really nice, awesome password there, right? So M&M, this guy's rocks. His password is M&M. All right, so, but we got hashes. We want to try to get rid of some of these hashes. So we've got a module in here called LeakDB. For those of you that aren't familiar with the LeakDB website, it's a very, very thorough reverse hash lookup resource. So let's go and let's run it. It's going to pull all those hashes and it's going to try to reverse them. Sometimes you get varying levels. All right. So, oh, you wait. You haven't seen the good one yet. So we have TTP about 10 seconds. So we've got, I can't remember what I was going to say now. But in any case, LeakDB. Yeah. Boy, these FBI fellows, right? What can you do, right? So yeah, that was fun, right? All right. So we go back here now, we show creds. We got a lot of data to work with. A lot of data to work with, right? And we've done all this, folks, with absolutely no exploits, all right? A little bit of money, a little bit of time, a little bit of open source reconnaissance, and we've got full reconnaissance of hosts, full reconnaissance of contacts, and some active credentials that we very well may be able to log into VPNs and websites with. And I'll tell you firsthand experience, we've had, I think, 2 assessments where we've gone into the assessment, we're able to log directly into either a website or a remote VPN without ever having touched the environment prior to that, right? Black box testing, logging straight into the environment. If we can do this as penetration testers, what can nation states and real bad guys use it for, right? Serious stuff here, but very, very, very strong capability that it provides us. What time do I got here? Anybody got time? 5 minutes? Okay, good deal. Perfect. So the next thing I'll do once I've gone this far is I'll do some physical reconnaissance using a tool I call Pushpin. For those that aren't familiar with Pushpin, it's a geotagged social media aggregator. So basically it takes stuff like Twitter, or tweets from Twitter, images from Picasa and Flickr, videos from YouTube, and Shodan output that's been geotagged, which means that it's been uploaded to those resources with GPS data attached to it. It searches them, pulls all of them down within a certain radius of a point on the globe that you give it, and then plots it on a map for you and gives you all of the information. So that you can literally go, for those of you that were at the talk last year, I ran Pushpin against Building 1, Cupertino, California. Was it the Apple headquarters, whatever it was? And we had pictures of the inside of the entry control points, outside of the entry control points. People posted pictures of their badges. There's some guys on YouTube that documented them wanted to sleep outside the building, and so they documented the whole process of how they got past the guards in order to do so. Right? All this information we can leverage to then go and do physical reconnaissance of the target without ever actually setting foot around in the surrounding area. Right? So now Pushpin's been integrated into Recon NG. It's no longer a separate script. Some benefits that brings with it is now you have continuous data. Twitter cycles, about every 36 hours? Once 36 hours has passed, you're lucky if you can get an old tweet. Well, if you've got the Pushpin modules running once every couple of days, all that data is stored in the database, and it can just continues to update the data. And you can have a really, really complete look on what the physical environment looks like. Right? And also, it's very extensible now. Anybody that knows of a particular resource that would be really good for this, you can go build that module for Recon NG and extend the capability of Pushpin. So beyond reconnaissance with Recon NG, it's got some discovery modules built into it. Some guys have put together some really neat stuff here that'll actually search on a particular web page for exploitable pages, that stuff that are known exploits, certain cold fusion pages and stuff like that. DNS cache snooping for AV detection. This is something that Rob Dixon put together about a year ago in a script, and we implemented into Recon NG. It's really nice for trying to detect what AV is running on your target network. We have also discovery modules that look for backup files in certain spaces and interesting files such as server status, and I think it's ELSA on .NET. Basically, they're server status pages that are public facing. Right, so some good information you can get through these discovery modules, and then just recently I moved into exploitation by writing a couple of modules that do XPath brute forcing and that leverage command injection vulnerabilities. So one thing that was pointed out to me at Black Hat was that the framework is just a perfect model for doing a lot of this stuff. Even though its original purpose is open source reconnaissance, there's some really neat capability there, and we can build this thing into something much larger, although the focus right now is passive reconnaissance. Now, what good is a tool without some level of output, some level of reporting? There's some reporting built into it. All right, there's some stuff that's for analysis you can output to CSV so that you can import it into Excel and look at the data that way. You can create the Pushpin reports, obviously, for your analysis there. For compatibility, you can output straight lists of, say, like email addresses or passwords or usernames to use in those different types of attacks we talked about earlier. And then obviously for your deliverable, there's an HTML output that you can sanitize and actually give to the customer that says, here's all the data that we harvested on you during the reconnaissance process. So that's Recon NG, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the talk. This will probably be the last time I give it for a while. Thank you. And for those of you that follow me on Twitter, you heard a little thing about twerking between me and DerbyCon the other day. So I just want to leave you with this. And there's any